All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Teves, Mrs. Selma Woolf, with immense gratitude for the refuos of Hashem and the merit of refuah sheleima for all of those in need, and the zchus of our brave soldiers and the return of our hostages. Leah Sol, as a zchus for refuah sheleima for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther, for the safety of our soldiers and the safe return of all of the hostages to their families. Our week of learning sponsors, Chazzan Mark Charles of Santa Barbara, California, in appreciation of the Daf Yomi and for the aliya and for the refuah sheleima, of Binyomin Yankel ben Bayla. We dedicate our learning Le'ilui Nishmas Staff Sergeant Elisha Yonatan Lober, Sergeant First Class Yosef Guitars, and Staff Sergeant Daniel Nachmani, who have given their lives al Kidushas Ha'am V'Ha'aretz, as well as for Master Sergeant Eliyahu Michal Harush Hashem Yikom Damo. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu provide all of their neshamas with an aliya and their families with a Neshama. So with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Nun Daled 54, and we are picking up on Nun Gimel Amud Beis 53b. Basar de Bayo, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 lines up from the bottom. So we had a lot of back and forth yesterday. Actually, we were dealing with the interesting case about what happens if you have a situation of shar va'adam shedach v'alabar. You ultimately have a situation of a shar and a person, right? An ox and a person who push either another person or another ox into a bar. So the Gemara then went through all of the different, we'll call it buckets of liability, and who is responsible for what. One of the interesting things that came up at the end of yesterday's discussion, and again, in Merit Hashem, it'll come up again today, is the interpretation of the pasuk of Hamas Yihye Lo. So remember again, the pasuk by bar says, Bayla bar Yishalim, the owner of the pit shall pay damages. Kesef yashiv leba'alav, he will go ahead and literally pay money, ultimately again to the owner. V'hameis yihye lo, and ultimately again the corpse, the dead ox, will belong to him. Now the Gemara was interpreting that phrase yesterday to mean v'hameis yihye lo, that the only time that bar damages apply is in a situation where, technically speaking, you could keep the carcass. You could keep the nevel, you could keep the carcass of the dead ox. But in a situation where, let's say again, you wouldn't be able to keep the carcass. Now, what would be a case where you couldn't keep the carcass? Psuli hamukdashin, an animal that was consecrated. So an animal that was consecrated, even after it's dead, retains its sanctity, and therefore, again, you would not be permitted to keep the carcass. Perhaps that would be a situation where bar damages would not apply. So the Gemara says, Bazar di baya hadar pashta. After we posed the question, it was subsequently answered. So we'll say, remember again, there was a whole discussion about what to do with the pasuk of V'hameis yihye lo. So the Gemara says, if you use that pasuk ultimately to teach me that it comes to exclude an animal that you can't keep from bar damages, then halacha l'maaseh, from where do you learn the concept that the owners are responsible for dealing and disposing of and recapturing some of the expense or some of the damages from the actual carcass? Nafkalei min hameis yihye lo deshar. We learn it out from a different Hameis Yihye Lo. We learn it out ultimately again, actually from the pasuk of Muad, which talks about again by the damages of shar. So the Gemara says, "My chaz is the Hameis Yihye Lo deshar mafkis le lebayla netavla min nevela. Hameis Yihye Lo debar mafkis le ben lemish hameis shalo." So we'll say, so now essentially what we have is as follows. We have two phrases, Hameis Yihye Lo. One of them is by bar, and one of them is by muad. So the one by bar we're using to teach us that Allah L'maaseh, if it's a consecrated animal, ultimately again it's not subject to damages. And the second Hameis Yihye Lo, the one by muad, is coming to teach that the owner of the carcass is obligated to go ahead and dispose of it, sell it off, and recapture whatever amount of money he can from it. So the Gemara says, how do you know which phrase to use for each drasha? Eifachana, I could just as easily switch that around. To which the Gemara says, Mistabra, it would appear to be clear, Mistabra, Pater Gabe Bar, Hoil Pater Es Hakelim. So we'll say it makes sense to go ahead and put the exclusion by bar, because bar already has another exclusion, namely for kalim. Remember again, if utensils break or utensils rip in a bar, right, again, you're exempt from that. Adirabo. Tur gabi shar. I could just say just the opposite. I could put the exemption by shar, by muad. Why? Shekin pater bo chatzin nezek. Because we'll say, for example, again, a shar by a tam, you're pater from complete damages. You only have to pay chatzin nezek. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Kulei nezek mihas lo ashkachan. Ultimately, again, but you don't see an exemption from complete damages. Okay, so we'll say, so that sugya ends. Now, what's the takeaway? What's the takeaway from that sugya? So the takeaway from that sugya, ultimately, again, is going to be that we have two, and we're not finished with this yet, but we have two psukim. That phrase appears two times. Literally, again, the dead animal will be his. That phrase appears two times. Number one, by bar damages, and number two, by muad. We know that ultimately, again, it's coming to exclude something. The shayla is, what is it coming to exclude? Again, so right now, what the Gemara is suggesting is that v'hameis lo by bar is coming to exclude an animal that has ritual sanctity, that such an animal is not subject to bar damages. And v'hameis lo, when it comes to muad, is coming to teach me that the owner of the carcass is obligated to go ahead and dispose of it, sell it off, and remember again, as we saw a couple of weeks ago already, that amount that you recapture, that offsets the damages. But that responsibility is upon the owner himself. Okay, let's go back there. So remember again, the Mishnah said that Allah said if you have a shar, and the shar was, let's say, holding utensils on its body, falls into the pit. Right, so remember again, the owner of the pit is responsible for any damages done to the shar, but is exempt for damages done to the utensils. So says the Gemara, Maslisin de lo Rebbe Huda. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Huda. Now why not? Watch this. Tisanya, Rabbi Huda mechayiv al niske kelim babar. Now I will say, it's interesting because this concept that bar, or I should say shar velo kelim, right? The idea ultimately, again, that you're responsible for damages done to an animal, but not responsible for damages done to utensils, is something we've seen reinforced over and over. Now the Gemara just suggests there is an alternate opinion. That alternate opinion is of Rabbi Huda, and Rabbi Huda holds that you are chayiv for bar damage done to utensils. So we'll say, so now essentially we have machlokas. The Rabbanon hold that you are not chayiv for utensil damage done in a bar. You're not chayiv for kelim. Rabbi Huda holds you are. So now let's analyze the root of the machlokas. So my time is the Rabbanon. What's the logic of the Rabbanon who hold that you're not chayiv for kelim in a bar? The Amar Kra, because the pasuk says v'nafal shama shar al chamar. So I'll say the pasuk says. Now I'll say understand. The pasuk itself is inherently repetitive, right? The Torah is speaking about bar says v'nafal shama shar al chamar. A shar or a chamar will go ahead and fall into the pit. Now I will say you don't need shar or chamar. First of all, you don't need anything. What could it just say? V'nafal sham behema. So already, again, once you're getting into a list of shar and chamar, that would appear to be unnecessarily repetitive. So obviously it's for a drasha. So watch this. The Gemara says, shar v'lo adam. Shar teaches us that you're only chayiv for liability for a pit by an animal and not by a person. So if I dig a pit and a person falls into my pit and gets damaged, ultimately, again, I'm not liable. This is the position of the Rabbanon. Chamar v'lo kelim. And chamar teaches me that what? Only for an animal, but not for utensils. So we'll say that's it. That's the position of the Rabbanon. Ultimately, again, shar teaches me shar v'lo adam, only chayiv for animal liability, not for people. Chamar, only for animals and not for utensils. Rabbi Huda, so the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda, o l'rabos es hakelim. So we'll say, Rabbi Huda says like this. The pasuk says, shar, o chamar. So remember, again, we'll see what shar and chamar do, but Rabbi Huda understands as a ribui, is an inclusionary phrase. And what does it come to include? Utensils. Utensils, that Allah Chalamaysa, again, you are chayiv for utensils. I, v'rabbanon, top of nundal, v'rabbanon, mi boy le lechalik. The Rabbanon used the phrase or the word to make a distinction. Now, what does that mean? Look at Rashi, lechalik. Delo tema eno chayiv ad sheyipol sham shar v'chamar biyachad. So Rabbi said, this is interesting. So the Rabbanon say you need the word o. Why? Because without the word o, if the pasuk would have said shar v'chamar, you would have thought that when is there bar liability? If you're having a really bad day, that's not shar liability, right? That both your shar and chamar fall in. O is there to teach me that no, you don't need both of them to fall in. It's one or the other. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda lechalik mivin nafal nafka. So Rabbi Yehuda says v'nafal. You learn out v'nafal. Also, v'nafal is singular. It's singular. So when it says v'nafal sham shar al chamar, v'nafal by definition means then ultimately again one of them is falling in. If that's the case, O is extra according to Rabbi Yehuda, and O comes to teach you that there's liability for kelim as well. V'rabanan v'nafal tuva mashma. The Rabbanan say that's not true. The word v'nafal sometimes could be used in the plural. Okay? So the Gemara says, Ema. So first I said, these are machlokas. So machlokas, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, is there liability ultimately again for utensil damage in a bar? Rabbanan, no. Rabbi Yehuda, yes. Based on their respective exposition of the verse, of the pasuk. Good. So I asked the Gemara ve'ema v'nafal klal. So we'll say, so now the Gemara is going to ask, why don't you dash in the pasuk in a different way? Say, v'nafal is a klal, a general statement. Shar v'chamar prat. So we'll say, then you have shar and chamar, which is a specific phrase. What do I have over here? A klal and a prat. So as I remember again, klal prat is an exegetical principle through which you darshan a pasuk. Whenever you have a klal prat, ein bichlal alamashe beprat. The klal itself is defined by the prat, right? So the general phrase v'nafal is going to be defined ultimately again by the specific phrase shar v'chamar. Mashe beprat shar v'chamar ein midi achrini lo. So the Gemara says just like the prat is dafka shar v'chamar, so maybe v'nafal only applies to shar v'chamar. In other words, we'll say maybe what the pasuk is teaching me is the only time there's bar liability is when literally when it's a shar or a chamar. That's it. To which the Gemara says, Amri bal habar yishalem chazar v'kalal. No, because we'll say there's another klal at the end. What's the klal at the end? The pasuk says the owner of the pit shall pay damages. Okay? So therefore, Abba say, what is it? Klal uprat uklal. So it turns out that the way this pasuk is set up is, it's a general statement, klal, right? Or I should say, not really general. It's really a general statement, a prat, a specific statement, and then another general statement. So whenever you have a klal uprat uklal, how do you dash in that? So ultimately, I will say the way to look at the entire thing is through the lens of the prat. Maha prat mefurash balei chaim. But say just like the prat, shar or chamar is what? It's balei chaim. It's a living creature. Af kol balei chaim. It's coming to teach me that there is bar liability for all living creatures. Gemara said, 1 second. Maybe I'll say like this. Maybe also the way to look at it is the follows. What's unique about the prat? Shara chamar. Shara chamar, I say, is something that its nevela, its carcass, conveys tuma either by maga, direct contact, or masa, carrying. So maybe I would say, af kol davar shenevela mitam maga masa. Maybe I will say, when is there bar liability? Only for something through which you contract tuma, ultimately again by carrying or touching, or I should say by touching and carrying maga masa. Now, what would that come to exclude? Aval ulfos lo. So maybe it comes to exclude, I will say, fowl, birds. Now, I will say, we know what's halacha by birds. Interestingly enough, bird carcasses do not convey tumah through maga and masa. So how do bird carcasses convey tumah? Well, it depends. If it's a kosher bird, it doesn't convey tumah. If it's a non-kosher bird, it'll convey tumah bebeis habliya, when you swallow it. So maybe the klalu prat klal means like this. What's unique about shar and chamar? Shar and chamar, when they're their carcass conveys tumah through maga, direct contact, masa, carrying. So maybe, although it would be an interesting drasha, maybe the only time that there is bar liability is for something which conveys tumah through maga and masa, but birds not. To which the Gemara says, "Im kain nichtov rachmana chad prata." If that's the case, then most of the Torah should have just said either shar or chamar. You don't need both. So the Gemara says, okay, well, hey nichtov, which one should you write? Say im nichtov shar. If it would just say shar, hava min karav l'gavi mizbeach in, shekarav l'gavi mizbeach lo. Well, say if it would have just said shar, what's unique about shar? Shar is what can be offered up as a carbon. So maybe the only type of animal for which there is bar liability is the type of animal for which you could offer up on a mizbeach. But if you can't offer it up as a carbon, maybe there's no bar liability. Therefore, again, therefore that's right, chamar. Because of chamar, if it would have just said chamar, have aminu kadosh bebechorein, shin kadosh bebechorelon. We'll say, what's unique about chamar? As much as chamar is not a kosher animal, and as much as chamar a donkey cannot be offered up on the mizbeach, but interestingly enough, chamar does have firstborn sanctity. Firstborn sanctity, right? So maybe only a chamar which has firstborn sanctity, maybe, or maybe an animal, or maybe only an animal which could have firstborn sanctity, has the ability, or is subject to damages by bar. Ela Amar Kra, therefore the pasuk says, "V'hamesi hiyalo kol dibar misa." So the pasuk says the phrase "V'hamesi hiyalo," the dead animal will belong to him, teaches us that what? Anything that is subject to death, I shouldn't say subject to death, but I shouldn't say anything that's in the parsha of dying, ultimately again is subject to bar damages. What's in the parsha of dying? All animals. Says the Gemara, well, if that's the case, bein l'Rabbanan de kamemati lehu kelim, or bein l'Rabbi Yehuda de kamarbi lehu lekelim, kelim b'nei misaninhu. So I'll say, here's the problem with that drasha. The problem with that drasha is, what you now seem to be telling me, is that based on the phrase shar ar chamar tells you that halacha l'maisa, anything that is subject to dying, right? Anything that's in the parsha of dying, ultimately, again, is in the parsha of bar damages. But here's the interesting part. According to the Rabbanan learn out, right? The Rabbanan have to exclude kelim from bar damages. And ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda includes kelim in bar damages. But I will say, but if the metric for bar damages is something that is subject to death, then why do you even have to have a discussion about kelim at all? The Rabbanan don't need a drasha to exclude kelim because kelim are not subject to death. Rabbi Yehuda, how could you include kelim because kelim are not subject to death? So what's going on over here? Well, this is actually pretty incredible. To which the Gemara says, no. Kelim b'nei misaninhu. Kelim, right? Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, Amri shvirasan zohi misasan. Now we'll say kelim are subject to death. What's the death of kelim? Smashing of them. Right? Shvirasan zohi misasan. Ultimately, again, the smashing of a kli, ultimately, again, is its death. Okay, so let's say, so therefore, again, if you look at Rashi says over here, actually, we don't have to look at Rashi. Shvirasan zohi misasan. Ultimately, again, so the breaking of the kli is its death, and therefore, again, the Rabbanon will need an exclusion for it, and Rabbi Yehuda will need an inclusion for it. Incredible. Well, so, it's interesting, just like al derech hashkafa, so Adam, man, is often compared to a kli. Man is compared to a kli. Right? We find these references. We find these references in the in Yamim Noran. Hareani lefanecha kichli malibusha uchlima. Right? This is in the Yuratza at the end of Shmona Esrei Yamim Noran. I am like a utensil, kli malibusha, a utensil filled with busha uchlima. So I was saying, so what's tshuva? So there are different forms of tshuva. Sometimes tshuva is cleaning out your kli. Like there's a lot of stuff in my kli that I should not have. A lot of stuff in my personal utensil. I always say, but sometimes tshuva is breaking your kli. Sometimes the kli that I have is just not the right utensil. Sometimes it's just not the right utensil. And ultimately, and sometimes I just have to remake myself. And we know this. We have different times of life. Sometimes the utensil is good. It's just filled with the wrong stuff. I need to clean it out. Sometimes the utensil itself is just not the right kli. Maybe once upon a time it was the right kli. Maybe it was never the right kli. But what I know now is that it's not the right kli for me now. It has to be broken and reconstructed. Sometimes in life you just need a tweak, and sometimes in life you need to start over. Sometimes you need to clean out, sometimes you need to break. So ultimately, so now watch this. So now we're transitioning a little bit to a different discussion. So just keep track of the machlokas we have. So machlokas number one, which is the primary discussion over here, is the machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanon about bar liability for utensils. The Rabbanon, you're not liable for utensils in a bar. Rabbi Yehuda, you are liable for utensils in a bar. Now, Rabbi said, now the beauty of it is, whereas we've known these positions before, now we've gone through their drashos, right? Now we literally see what each of them hold. Now the Gemara says, okay, let's bring up something else. The Gemara says, good. Ularav, the Amar Bar Shechayva Lav Torah, the Havala V'lo Lechabato. So we'll say, remember again, we had Rav. We actually had Rav in yesterday's daf. According to Rav, originally we saw this on Shabbos. Right? According to Rav, who says, Rabbi say that the damaging power of bar is not in its impact, but rather what? The damaging power of bar is in the noxious air that the bar releases. So the Rav Damar Bar Shechayva Lav Torah, the Havala V'lo Lechabato. So I have a question. Now, I will say we're spending time over here in a whole discussion about whether or not you're obligated for damages to kalim in a utensil. For damages to kalim in a bar, utensils in a bar. I will say, now remember again, let's take a step back. Rav says that what's the damaging power of bar? It's the air. So why are we arguing about utensils? Why would anyone hold that there's utensil? Why do you have to talk about utensil? Does noxious air have a negative impact on utensils? To which the Gemara says, yeah. The Gemara says, actually, Amri becharati de mifkai mihavla. As you will say, apparently new utensils actually could break as a result of the noxious air unlocked by digging the pit. Okay, so apparently, again, noxious air could have an impact on kalim as well. To which the Gemara says, okay, Sahai, v'ameis yelo mi Bayla lichid rava. One second, I will say. Now remember again, let's go back for just a second. That phrase, v'ameis yelo, which we were speaking about in our previous. So remember again, we have two phrases, v'ameis yelo. One of them ultimately, again, was by bar, and one of them was by muad. The Gemara says, Hi v'ameis yelo mi Bayla lichid rava. The phrase v'ameis yelo, we need that for Rava. Da'amar Rava, sharp psuli hamukdashin, shenafa lebar pater. Rava said, if you have a shar that's psuli hamukdashin, right? Ultimately, again, a shar that essentially, again, has sanctity. Now, Rashi, remember again, on the beginning of Amud Beis, yesterday gave the example of a bachar bal mum, a firstborn animal that was blemished, that still retained some of its sanctity. So therefore, again, let's say you have a psuli mukdashin that fell into a bar. Pater, the owner of the bar is pater. Why? Shene'emar v'hameisi hielo b'misha meishalo yotzeh she'ena meishalo. So Moshe, remember again, we were just talking about before. So if you have an animal that has some level of sanctity that falls into the bar, so the owner of the bar is not liable. Why not? Because halacha l'maaseh, the only time there's bar liability is when I was saying, when the owner of the pit would seemingly get use out of the carcass. But if he can't get use out of the carcass, why not in this case? Because it has some level of sanctity, therefore no bar damages. That's the drasha. So the Gemara says, Ela Amakra Kesaf Yashiv Leba'alav. Therefore also the pasuk says, ultimately again he shall return money to the owner. The Rabbos called the Islay Baylim. This comes to include anything that has an owner. That there's bar liability for anything that has an owner. If that's the case, if that's the case, then why isn't there bar liability for utensils and the person? Because once we go back to the Josh of the Rabbanon before that shar teaches us shar and not a person, chamar and not utensils. I have Rabbi Yehuda the kamar b'lu l'kelim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who understands that comes to teach me that there's liability for utensils as well. Bishlam shar mema'id ba'adam. I understand why shar could exclude an adam, a person, from bar liability or from bar damages. Ela chamar my mema'id be. But what does he use chamar for? Ela amarava chamar debar the Rabbi Yehuda v'sed da'aveda l'divrei hakol kashya. So the Gemara says you're right. The one difficulty of Jose in Rabbi Yehuda's drasha, ultimately again, is what does he do with chamar? See, remember again. Let's come full circle over here. We'll say, what is the core machlokes that we're dealing with over here? Again, we'll say this is one of these yesodistic, fundamental machlokim that you have to keep in mind. A fundamental machlokes in the scope of liability for bar. Right? So remember again, you have machlokes Rabbanon and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbanon, there is bar liability ultimately again for animals, for animals, but not for utensils. Rabbi Yehuda, even for utensils. What is it based on? So now I have the drasha. So Rabbanon, the pasuk was speaking about bar liability. Says, Ki yiftach ishbar chiyichra ishbar v'lo yichasenu v'nafal shama shar or chamar. The pasuk was speaking about bar liability. Speaks about again a shar or a chamar coming in. I will say, just to understand, just so we appreciate the drasha, that pasuk from its inception is redundant, right? Why is it redundant? What could it just said? Behema. Why are you putting in there shar or chamar? So again, the Rabbanan say shar comes to teach me shar. You're liable for shar, but not for people. We'll see why there's no liability for people. And chamar, you're liable for again animals, but what? Not for kalim. Rabbi Yehuda says the O comes to teach me. The O comes to teach me that you're chayiv not only for animals but also for kalim. What does Rabbi Yehuda do with shar? Rabbi Yehuda agrees that shar comes to exclude shar v'lo adam, not people. What does Rabbi Yehuda do with chamar? We don't know. That's the hole in Rabbi Yehuda's drasha. What does he do with that extra word chamar? So that I will say that piece still remains outstanding. So the Gemara says chamar for Rabbi Yehuda, and then the Gemara brings up another example of ultimately again sed da'aveda. Now, what's the case of Sed Da'aveda? Look at Rashi. Rashi is about 5 lines up from the bottom. Sed Da'aveda. Rashi says, Kevan dechsiv l'chol aveda sachicha, laman li dikasav rachmana chamar v'shar v'seh v'salma. So we'll say the pasuk is talking about the mitzvah of hashavas aveda, returning a lost object. So the Torah gives a whole list over here, right? If your friend goes out and loses his donkey, his donkey, his shar, his sheep, his clothing. So the Gemara darshans why the need for each of those things, but when it comes to seh, the Gemara doesn't have a drasha. So I will say, the Gemara says seh, and that pasuk is an outstanding question, and chamor, according to Rabbi Yehuda, also is going to be an ongoing question. Good. So I will say, this is our machlokes. We're not finished with it yet. It's still out there. Good. So we'll say, we're going to see how we paskin halacha l'maisa, but just keep that machlokes in mind. Good. Let's go weiter. Nafal l'socho shar chirish v'shota v'katan chayiv. So we'll say, now, according to the Mishnah says, if a shar chirish shota v'katan fell into the pit, you're chayiv. So the Gemara says, let's analyze this phrase. My shar chirish shota v'katan. What does that mean? Ilema shar shal chirish shota shar shal chirish shar shal shota shar shal katan. Shabbos say if you say it's talking about a shar that belongs to a chirish, to a shota, or to a katan, so you're liable for that. Is that to say hashar shal pikeach pater? So I don't understand. If the shar belongs to a chirish, to a shota, to a katan, and it falls into my pit, I'm liable. But if the shar belongs to a normal, regular person, I'm not chayiv, right? I'm not chayiv. That doesn't make any sense. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan, no. Shar shu cheresh, shar shu shota, shar shu katan. The Rabbi will say, actually, what the Mishnah is doing is the Mishnah is actually describing the shar. We're talking about a shar, ultimately, again, that lacks basic animal capacity. The animal itself is insane. The animal itself is uncommunicative. Right? The animal itself, so to speak, katan, in other words, is immature. So the Gemara says, that's what we're talking about. Amud beis. So the Gemara says, ha sharshu bikeach pater. So what do you see from here? No. So we'll say, what the Mishnah is going to tell me is as follows. Apparently, the only time that there is bar liability is when you have a shar that is compromised. But if the shar itself is a pikeach, what is a pikeach shar? A regular, well-adjusted, happy, competent shar, right? That type of shar, if it falls into a pit, there is no liability for the owner of the bar, which is fascinating. So the Gemara says, let's analyze. Rabbi Yirmiyah, lo mi bai kamar. Lo mi bai shar shul pikeach techayiv. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says like this. No, perhaps the read is like this. Of course there is liability, ultimately, again, for a normal, regular shar, right? So that goes without saying. Aval shar cheresh shota v'kad ima charushasul garmalo katanusal garmalo v'li pater. I might have thought that maybe again abosai when a shar that's a cheresh, a shota, or a katan falls into a pit, then what's the halacha? Maybe there's no liability. Why? It's not the pit that killed it. Rather, what is it? It's its own impairments that killed it. Kamash Malan, the Mishnah tells me, no, it is the pit that killed it, and therefore there's going to be liability. All right. But we learned, Nafal bar das potter. But we have another interesting brayso. Look what the brayso says. The brayso says that if you have a bar das, what does bar das mean? A competent, right? Bar das is potter. So the Gemara says, my love shar bar das. Are we not talking about today, we'll say, what we call a shar bar das? Now what's a shar bar das? Like just a regular, normal, competent shar. So it sounds like it was, which is really quite fascinating, which is that if a shar is capable, quote unquote, has basic shar das, there is no bar liability if it falls in. Amrale lo adam. No, that's not referring to shar, it's actually referring to a person. And it's telling you that if a person who's a bar das falls into a pit, there's no liability there. Okay, elame ata adam ben das hu de patar halav ben das de chayiv. So now you're telling me then about said that if a person has das and he falls in, you're pater for bar. But if he doesn't have das and he falls in, the bala bar is chayiv. But what did we just say? What was Josh of the Rabbanon? Shar v'lo adam ksiv. But the Josh of the Rabbanon we just had was that shar, the word shar comes to exclude adam, that there is no liability for damage done to people in a bar. Elamai ben das, rather Rabbi say, what do you have to say is a ben das? Min ben das. Rather Rabbi say, you have to say that ben das refers to any species that has das. Now, which species have das? Animals have das also. So therefore, Rabbi say, it sounds like over here that any time that the damaged party has das, so there is not bar liability. To which the Gemara says, Amalei, Vatanya, but we learned, Nafal Socho Shar Ben Das Potter. But we learned, we'll say that Allah, and therefore again, we learned that if a Shar Ben Das falls into a pit, ultimately you're Potter. So we'll say, what is going on over here? So listen, we'll say, this is actually incredible. Elama Rava. Rava says, what are we going to say? Shar V'hu Cheresh, Shar V'hu Shota, Shar V'hu Katan, Dafka. So we'll say, Rava says like this. Here's what the Mishnah is coming to teach me. The Mishnah is going to teach you that halacha l'maisa, if the shar ultimately again, if the shar lacks capacity, right? The shar lacks capacity, right? And ultimately goes ahead and falls into a pit and dies, that's when there's going to be liability. That's going to be liability. Aval shar b'hu b'keach pater. But if the shar is a quote unquote normal shar that has basic shar das and falls into a pit, you're going to be pater. My time will say first why line. This is incredible. My time. Did boy lay iyune umezel? I will say this is actually incredible. I will say there is an assumption. We spoke about this yesterday. There is an assumption that animals understand the need to avoid danger. Animals, right, are pre-programmed to ultimately again avoid danger. So I will say because of that, it's understood that if an animal sees a pit, what is it going to do? It's going to walk around it. And therefore, again, if the animal doesn't walk around it, that is not the fault of the owner of the pit. The only time the owner of the pit ultimately is liable is when the animal lacks the capacity to avoid danger. Then the owner of the pit created this situation is going to be liable. But if the animal has capacity and doesn't avoid danger, then halacha l'maaseh, the animal itself is going to be liable. Incredible, I will say. Incredible. Let's say, also see, we spoke about the Musar in this, about if animals avoid danger, alachas Kamma v'Kamma, we have to summon up the intellect to avoid dangerous situations as well. It also tells you just the incredible profundity of the Ribono Shel Olam's creation. The Ribono Shel Olam, he created everything with the inherent ability to avoid dangerous situations. Man has a more sophisticated danger radar and is supposed to use it. But animals, I remember when we were in South Africa a number of years ago. So I remember this, that it was during the migration season, like across the Serengeti. And what was incredible is, so the way this works is the animals migrate and they cross certain bodies of water. Now, the way it works is in the herds, there are always going to be the entire herd doesn't make it across the water. Some of them drown over the course of the water. But the herd itself moves, even though members of the herd are going to drown. Why? Because it's understood that for the continuity of the herd has to cross. The herd has to cross. It's incredible. They walk in there knowing that some of them are not coming up on the other side. but the herd can't break apart, because if the herd breaks apart, then again it's over. So the herd moves, recognizing that sacrifices are going to be made. It's a profound yesod in general. We have this concept in Yiddishkeit as well, that the needs of the collective outweigh the needs of the individual. That's true for Klal Yisrael as well. But Lamaisa, this profound idea that you have to get from point A to point B in order to go ahead and avoid the dangerous situation. So you do what you have to do. So both sides, this is incredible. This translates into bar liability as well. So if I will say, this is not, before this sugi, this is not the way we looked at bar. Right? The way we looked at bar was what? If you go ahead and you dig a pit, and an animal falls into the pit, what's the halacha? What's halacha? Chayiv. Now the Gemara says, that's actually not the halacha. Oh, well, we'll see in the Rambam, but that's not the halacha. The halacha is if you dig a pit, and a regular, normal, well-adjusted, happy animal, falls in, you're not liable for that. You're not liable for that. That's actually on the animal or on the owner, because even animals have a pre-programmed danger radar. They should be able to avoid. So where is their liability? If you have a heroically of a cotton animal, right? The animal didn't have that radar. The animal didn't have that ability to circumvent danger. That's when there is going to go ahead and be liability. So my time, what's the reason? First white line, did Bayla the animal should have looked where it's going and avoided the pit. That supports this. I will say therefore, look what the Brisa says. If a shar is a chere shot of a cotton, or it's blind, or it's traveling at night, common denominator amongst all these situations, doesn't necessarily have the ability to sense the danger and avoid it, chayiv. Then you're going to be chayiv. Pikeach u'mahalech bayom. That the animal ultimately, again, is a normal, healthy, well-adjusted animal, right? Or walking by day, ultimately, and falls into a pit, pater. Ultimately, the owner of the pit is going to be pater because that's on the animal. And I will say, this is in fact how the Rambam paskins. The Rambam paskins in Hilchos Niskei Mammon, Perek Yud Beis, Halacha Tes Zayin, says as follows. Listen to this. The Gemara says, Elim Haisa Behema, Kitana, O chareshes, O shota, O suma, O shenafla balayla. When is there bar liability for an animal? If the animal again is a ketana, cheresh, shota, blind, or fell into the pit at night. Aval, em haisa pikachas, v'nafla bayomu meisa, pater, shezekimo ones, mipnei shederech habehema liros, v'lasra minamech shalos. So what says incredible, it's not the Rambam Paskins, that Allah Chalamaysa, there's a responsibility upon the animal to avoid danger as well. So and animals are pre-programmed to avoid danger. So therefore, again, if it's daytime, the animal is a regular animal, should know, but falls in anyway. I, the owner of the pit and potter. Why? That is like an ones. That is like an ones in extenuating circumstance, and therefore there's no liability. I will say, absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. Fascinating. Okay, go say that's Talachama. So good. Let's see the Mishnah. Echad sharvi echad kol behema. So we'll say, so actually this is a really great sugya. So we'll say, so now the Mishnah says as follows. Whether it's a shar or any other animal, so we'll say what we're going to see is that this Mishnah goes through that animals are grouped together, so to speak. Now, why is this coming up over here? Because I will say, remember again, the whole this previous discussion we were talking about was the fact that the Torah goes out of its way to mention shar o chamar, when in fact it could have just said behema. Now obviously again that's relevant. We have to make a drush from that. Now the Mishnah says there are certain halachas for which all animals are kind of grouped together. So here we go. Echad shar v'echad kol behema. So whether shar any other animal, then the filas habar. So I will say, so all animals are treated the same when it comes to bar liability. Ula hafrashas har Sinai. So what's hafrashas har Sinai? The halacha was that when the Shechina descended upon Har Sinai, this is by Matan Torah, Sinaitic revelation. When the Shechina came down on Har Sinai, the halacha was that all people and all animals had to be distanced from the mountain. So which type of animals did it apply to? All animals. Good. That's Hafrashas Har Sinai. L'tashlumin keithal. But let's say if you steal an animal, and ultimately again you're found to be the thief. What now? We're not talking about again a case of slaughtering and selling. That's arba v'chamish. That's something different. But assuming you stole an animal, you're found to be a thief. What's the halacha? You have to pay principal and kefil, right? So you pay a double payment. So again, that applies to all animals. La shavas aveda. Again, remember if an animal is lost, there's a mitzvah to return it to its owner. That mitzvah applies to all animals. Next, lepriga. We'll say prika means if you see an animal that is carrying a heavy load, and ultimately, again, it's buckling under its load, there's a mitzvah to assist the owner in unloading the animal. Ulechasima. We'll say the halacha is that when the animal is plowing, you're not permitted to go ahead and muzzle it. Right? So the Gemara says, kilayim. We'll say now, kilayim, we're going to see there are two cases over here. One possibility is, kilayim can mean plowing with two different species of animals hitched to the same yoke. That's kilayim. Or kilayim could also mean breeding different species together. Okay? The Shabbos. So we'll say Shabbos refers to you're not allowed to work your animals on Shabbos. So which animals does this apply to? All animals. And also in the same will apply to a chaya. Remember again, chaya is a non-domesticated animal. Oaf is birds or fowl. So the Gemara says, so essentially the Mishnah saying is like this. Any halacha that applies to animals, applies what? To all animals. To all animals. And by the way, not only all behemoths, but also applies to what? A chaya and oaf as well. Lama ne'amar shah or chamar. So I'll say if that's the case, what you're telling me is that anytime Torah talks about an animal, it applies to all animals. And not only that, even when the Torah says shar or chamar, it also applies to all animals, including chaya and oaf. If that's the case, that it applies to everything, why does it say shar or chamar? Ela shadibra hakasav bahoba. We'll say sometimes the Torah just speaks, dibra hakasav bahoba is like saying dibra Torah kalashon manei adam. Because sometimes the Torah just speaks in everyday language. And kind of the phrase shar or chamar was like a colloquialism for behema. And behema is a colloquialism for all animals, including chaya and oaf. Beautiful. So let's analyze. The Gemara says, "Lenafila sabar." So I was saying, how do you know for nefila sabar? Right? For bar damages, it applies to all animals. Where do you get that from? So the Gemara says, "Kesef yashiv leba'alov." The pasuk says, ultimately you'll give back money to the owner. So the Gemara says, "Kol de'is le Baylan kida amran." So it refers to anything that has an owner. We just spoke about this right before, right? So anything that has an owner. Now, what kind of animal could have an owner? Any kind of animal could have an owner. And then for halacha l'maisa, bar damages apply to all animals. Good. La'afrashas har Sinai. So ultimately, again, it applies. So remember again, the obligation to distance all animals from Har Sinai applied to all animals. So where do you get this from? Im behema im ish lo yichya. So the Torah says im behema, right? Behema again im ish lo yichya. So it's a generally inclusive phrase. So it says v'chaya bichlal behema. Now in general, you have a principle that chaya is included in behema, and im l'rabos es ha'ofos. And the word im comes to include birds. Good. L'tashlumi kefal. So we'll say again, how do you know that all animals are obligated in the obligation to pay kefal? Double payment if you're found to be a thief. Kida'amrinon al kol davar pesha klal, al kol davar pshia. So we'll say the pasuk kol davar pesha, over any matter, over anything for which there is iniquity or guilt. Al kol davar pshia, for anything for which you could be a posheya, for which ultimately, again, you could commit a sin. La shavas haveda. So we'll say, I don't know if the Mitzvah Shavas Haveda returning lost object applies to all behemoths. L'chol avedas achicha. For anything that your brother loses, includes all animals. Leprika. How do I know again? I will say that if the animal is buckling under a load, that you have an obligation to about the owner and help to unload it. Yalif chamar mishabis. So we'll say, so there we make a gzera shavav chamar to Shabbos. Just like by Shabbos we include all animals, so too by Prika we'll include all animals. Lechasima, for the prohibition to muzzle the animal. Yalif shar mishabis, gzera shar from Shabbos. Likilayim. So we'll say, so now watch this. For kilayim, now we'll say, and I remember again, we mentioned before, there are two different possible cases of kilayim. Kilayim decharisha. Say for us, we were talking about again the prohibition to plow with two different species of animal hitched to the same yoke. So yalif shar mishabis. Then about to go make a gzir shavav shar from Shabbos. Kilayim darba. And if it's about breeding different species together, then yalif behemtecha mishabis. Then about say ultimately again we'll learn behema from Shabbos. The gabi Shabbos minalan. So we'll say by Shabbos, how do we know? The sign of Yosi Amishur Bishmal B'dibros Harishonos Nemar. So we'll say by the first set of commandments it says Avdecha v'amascha uvehemtecha. Okay, your servant, your maidservant, and your animal. So we'll say this is talking about the obligation that not only can you not perform malacha on Shabbos, but your servants, neither your servants nor your animals can do malacha on Shabbos. And And by the second set of dibros, what did it say? V'sharcha v'chamarcha v'chol behemtecha. Interesting, right? By the second set of dibros, what will say? It says, instead of just saying behema, it says shar and chamar as well. V'alo shar v'chamar b'chlal kol behema hayu. But 1 second, shar and chamar are included in behema. V'lama yatsu, so why are they now mentioned by themselves? Lomar lecha, ma shar v'chamar kan chaya v'of. Just like shar and chamar over here include chaya and of, kiyotze bahen. Af kol chaya v'of kiyotze bahen. So too again, Abba say comes to include chaya and of in every other scenario as well. Ema behema the dibros harishon is klal. Maybe behema Abba say the first set of dibros should be a klal. Sharcha v'chamarcha the dibros achronos prat. And shar and chamar the second set of dibros should be a prat. So Abba say, what do I have? Klal uprat. Klal uprat, if that's the case, ein bichlal alamasha beprat. So let's remember again, the way to darshan a klal uprat is that the klal is fully limited by the prat. So therefore, again, I would say, shar v'chamar ein midiachrin elo. Maybe a dafka only applies to shar and chamar, not to any other animal, to which the Gemara says, midiachrin elo amri. So the Gemara says, amri v'chol behemtecha, the dibros achronos, chazar v'kala. So now I have v'chol behemtecha, in the second set of dibros, the dibros say, what do I have? That's another klal. So I don't have a klal uprat. What do I have? Klal uprat uklal. How do you darshan a klal uprat uklal? Iya tadan ela prat. So we'll say. So therefore, I can remember the difference between a klal and a prat. So we'll say is in a klal uprat, the klal is fully limited by the prat. In a klal uprat uklal, the klal is defined, not limited, but defined by the prat. So we'll say. So what does this mean? Maha prat mufurash balechayim. So we'll say in this case again, what's the prat? The prat is shar and chamar. What's unique about shar and chamar? They're balechayim. They're living entities. Afkol balechayim. So therefore, we'll say it comes to include all animals, all balechayim. I ve'ema ma prat mufurash darish nevelasam tama ma gomasa. Maybe I should say just like the prat. We'll say shar and chamar. What's unique about shar and chamar? What's unique about shar and chamar, ultimately, again, is that alocha lamaisa, the nevela, ultimately, again, the carcass conveys tumah through maga and masa. Af kol davar shenivelasam tama b'maga masa. So he comes to include every other carcass that conveys tumah through either touching or through conveying. And I will say, remember again, what does that come to exclude? Aval ofos law, as we said before. Remember again, non-kosher bird ultimately will convey to him beis hablio and swallowing. Kosher bird, not at all. Maybe it comes to exclude birds. Amri imkein nichtov rachmana chad prata. If that's the case, the Torah could have just said one prat. So which prat? Hey nichtov rachmana. So what should the Torah say? I kasav rachmana shar. If it would have just said shar, have amir karvagad mizbeach in, shino karvagad mizbeach lo. It was the same thing as we had before. I would have thought, fine, if it would have just said shar, I would have thought, what kind of animal is included? Only the type of animal that could be offered up on a mizbeach. But the animal that's not offered up on the mizbeach maybe is not included. Therefore, kasav rachmana chamar. Therefore, the Torah includes chamar. The kasav rachmana chamar, but if you would have just said chamar, I would have said, have amina kodesh v'chorein, shein kodesh v'chore lo. Only an animal that has firstborn sanctity is included. Maybe an animal that doesn't is included. Therefore, kasav rachmana shar. Therefore, the Torah includes shar. Ella v'chol behemtecha ribuyahu. Shabbos, what you see over here is that the phrase v'chol behemtecha is ribuy to ultimately again mamish include all animals. V'chol heich. So I'll say fine. So that's the end of the discussion. Now the Gemara says, okay, so let's jump on that last point over here. So it's like, just takeaway message, Mishnah's teaching me, is that whenever you see a din that includes animals includes everything, right? It includes behemoths, chayas, ophos. And not only that, even when the Torah goes out of the way to write shar and chamar, even shar and chamar is not meant to limit anything to shar and chamar. Even shar and chamar itself means everything. So why does the Torah just write shar and chamar? So again, that's for all the darshanic principles that we've seen up until this point. Now the Gemara says something interesting. Now the Gemara says, well, 1 second. V'chol heichad dekasiv rachmana kol ribuyahu. Now let's jump on this last point. Do we say that every time the Torah writes the word kol, the word kol itself is always a ribuy, is always coming to include something else? V'hagabe meiser. The Bava say, look at what happened by Meiser Sheni. Now, what's going on by Meiser Sheni? Dechsev kol. And Rabbi said, now by Meiser Sheni, ultimately again the Torah uses the word kol, yet the Kadashina le bechlalu prat. Yet Rabbi say again, we use the word kol by Meiser Sheni to teach him a klalu prat. What did we learn by Meiser? Rabbi says it's actually quite fascinating. Desanya, listen to this. Rabbi say, and I remember again, let's talk about this just for a moment. Meiser Sheni, what's the halacha of Meiser Sheni? It's yours. Right? What's the only caveat by Meiser Sheni? You have to eat it in Yerushalayim. Now, what happens if Baruch Hashem, I have too much Meiser Sheni to go ahead and take up to Yerushalayim? So what can you do? You could redeem the Meiser Sheni with money, transfer Meiser Sheni sanctity to money, take the money to Yerushalayim, spend it on food, only food in Yerushalayim, and then the produce here becomes unconsecrated. So now watch this. The Torah says, "V'nasata hakesef b'chol asher ta'aveh nafshecha." So the pasuk says, when you take that money now, again, what we call that Meiser Sheni money, to Yerushalayim, what can you use it for? You could literally translate it, use the money for whatever you desire, whatever you want. Now we'll say, now that phrase is a klal, a general concept. Now we'll say, then the pasuk says, "Babakar ubatzon bayayin ubashechar." Then it says, what can you use it for? Bakar, cattle, tzon, sheep, yayin, wine, shechar, beer. Right? Beer. Say it for both again. So what is that? That's a prat. That's a prat. So I have a klal, spend the money on whatever you want. Then it says again, spend it on these specific things. That's the prat. Ubechol asher tish'alcha nafshecha. And whatever you want. Whatever your heart desires. So we'll say, what do you have over here? Chazav v'kalal. So what do you have? Klal, uprat, uklal. So we'll say, what I have therefore in this pasuk is a klal, a general statement. Right? Go ahead and buy whatever you want. But it's not because of, right, use money for whatever you want. Then prat, babakar, batzon, bayayin, b'shechar, prat. And then again, whatever you want, klal. So klal, uprat, uklal. So what's the halacha? So whenever you have a klal, uprat, uklal, so remember again, the prat comes to go ahead and define the scope of the klal. Maha prat mefurash pri, mi pri, ugidule karko. So we'll say, just like the prat ultimately means a pri that comes from a pri, something that comes from something else and grows from the ground. Right? So we'll say, if you look at that list, bakar, son, yayin, shechar, all of those things come from something else and grow from the ground. By the way, livestock is considered to be like it grows from the ground as well. Why? Because it's nourished from the ground. Right? It eats vegetation, nourished from the ground as well. So because it's nourished, ultimately considered as if it comes from the ground. So therefore again, af kol primi pri v'gidulei karka. So to anything, I will say, all right, boss, we're going to stop over here. I'm going to leave you with this drasha. So we'll pick up at Meretz Hashem Meiser Sheni tomorrow. Incredible. We'll say, what a daf today, chock full of profound yisodos, halachas, and hashkafas. We'll pick up at Meiser Sheni, finish off that cold drasha tomorrow. Shkoyach. Sorry? Tomorrow I got it, huh? Yeah, days. Beautiful. Incredible. All right, have a great day, everyone.